I was offered a strange job. The street I work in doesn't exist. Work just enough to make rent. That used to be my life motto back in the day. I watched my daddy break his back for pennies in the coal mines and quickly learned that we're expected to work harder than we ever need to. So the day I moved out of that torn-up two-bedroom shack, I let my wanderlust consume me. I traveled the world, working quick jobs whenever I needed extra cash. Courier, hog hunter, oil driller, private investigator's assistant, and alligator handler were just some of the professions I had. If there's a job out there, chances are I've done it. Would have kept going too, had I not knocked up a waitress in South Padre Island around 1993. Fatherhood really changes your perspective on life. I found a job at the post office and worked there until arthritis forced me to retire early. I do appreciate the irony of it all. Now I mostly spend my time drinking beer or watching after my grandbabies. I stumbled upon this subreddit a while ago and have been hooked on the stories ever since. I figured I might as well tell mine. Maybe I'll get some answers here. It was the summer of 1982, and I was chasing tail in New Orleans. I must have been around 23 or so, still in the first stage of my journey. At that time, I was working as a dog catcher, but after getting bit twice, I wasn't looking to make a career out of it. I glossed through the classified sections when a job posting caught my eye. Wanted. Young man with vehicle who can work nights. Must be able to follow directions. $100 per day. $100 doesn't stretch as far as it used to anymore, but you could go to the moon with that kind of cash back then. I was skeptical of the listing as I had naively inquired about jobs that seemed perfect but ended up with some weirdo trying to grab my crotch. But my left cheek was still in pain from the German Shepherd who nearly took a chunk of it, and my right cheek was still sore from the rabies shot. If I didn't find work soon, pretty sure my mangled ass would be on the streets. I called the number, and a man with a raspy voice answered. I explained I was calling about the gig, and I got an address to meet on the outskirts of town. I drove to a dilapidated dirt-brown office building called Henry LeBlanc Realty. A hefty middle-aged man answered the door and introduced himself as Hank. "You'll do, I guess," he said with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, unbothered as ash puttered down his faded green polo. We sat at a small poker table, the only place free from clutter in the cramped office space. "You got a big mouth, son?" he asked while studying at me with gold, rimless glasses that hung low on his nose. "Pardon." "A big mouth. You got one? 'Cause I need someone who can keep their trap shut." "I ain't no rat. What kind of job is this?" Hank waved me off. "I ain't asking you to do anything illegal, son. I just need someone who appreciates confidentiality." "You need me to sign anything or what?" Hank shook his head, clearly not appreciating my flippancy. "Don't need you to sign a thing. Just need to know I can trust you." "Yes, sir, you can." Hank sighed and leaned back into his chair. I could tell he was mulling over whether or not to give me the job. "Does that Cutlass out there have a radio in it?" he asked while gesturing toward my prized 1976 convertible I parked out front. "Yes, sir." "How loud does it get?" I smirked. It could wake up a whole block if I needed it to. Hank slowly nodded and rubbed the gray stubble on his chin. "Good. Here's what I need you to do." The job was weirdly simple. After midnight, I would drive my Cutlass to Metairie, a suburb outside New Orleans. I'd take a right on 50th Street and go down until I reached the dead end. Then I'd turn around and drive back up the street. All I had to do was make sure the music in my stereo was blasting at full volume. "That's it," I said a bit incredulously. "Yep, that's it. Can you start tonight?" I flirted with some women at a nearby dive bar, and closed my tab around 11:45. I hopped in the Cutlass and cruised to Metairie, feeling the hot summer breeze on my face. A neon green sign labeled 50th Street appeared, and I pulled over to the corner to turn on my radio. The street was dead silent, and all the streetlights were off except for the one flickering at the dead end. Come to think of it, it may have been the only light on at all. All of the homes, mostly shacks, appeared to be abandoned. Some had their windows shoddily boarded up with plywood. I flipped on the radio, and Rock With You by Michael Jackson began blasting. I let the Cutlass slowly meander toward the end of the street, peeking at the houses that clearly seemed empty. Just what the hell was I doing out here? I reached the circular dead end and whipped around, driving back down the street. As I went to turn out of the block, I could have sworn I saw the house at the corner turn its lights on. I turned the radio off and drove back to Hank's in silence. When I got to Hank's office, I was surprised to see him there. He was still smoking cigarettes and drinking from a cheap bottle of bourbon. His face was pale, and he looked incredibly anxious until he saw me. "Oh good, you're back," he said, the color returning to his face. "Yeah, of course," I said, perplexed as to why I wouldn't be. I stood in the door, shuffling my feet while Hank went out back. "Here," he said, handing me a crumpled $100 bill. "Can you work again tomorrow night?" I accepted and began my routine the following evening, buying everyone at the dive bar around with my newfound wealth. The drive to 50th Street seemed longer than usual, and I missed my turn several times trying to find it again. I blamed Jim Beam. After driving in a circle for almost an hour, I saw the neon green 50th Street sign flicker and skidded into the block. The street was silent again, and the light at the end flickered incessantly. I was fumbling for a cigarette when I heard a sound that made my stomach churn. It sounded both like an animal howling and sheet metal scraping together. I turned the brights on and hoisted myself up, but couldn't see a damn thing. Then my headlights quivered before going out entirely. I slammed my fist down on the dash and heard the hum of the lights restarting. Feeling unsettled, I turned on the radio and started blaring Physical by Olivia Newton-John, though my radio sounded more distorted than yesterday. I made my way down the street, squinting in the dark to try and see what was in front of me. I almost reached the end of the block when the Cutlass's engine sputtered and slowed to a stop. Now I took care of that Cutlass like it was my own child back in the day. It'd probably still be sitting in my garage had I not wrecked it 2 years later in Palo Alto, so it was almost inconceivable for it to just break down without giving me some notice. Perplexed, I lit another cigarette, grabbed my tools from the trunk, and opened the hood, where I was greeted by hot steam. I shone my flashlight and checked out the engine but didn't find anything unusual after the smoke cleared. It was like something temporarily disabled my car. Then things started to get weird. The temperature suddenly dropped. I went from wiping beads of sweat off my forehead to nearly shivering in the middle of July. The piercing sound I heard earlier ripped through the silence of the street and almost made me jump out of my boots. My eyes darted around as I felt I was being watched, but it still seemed like I was the only one in the neighborhood. I took a deep breath and carefully slipped into my car to slow my heart rate down. Thankfully, it turned one, and I sped out of the street, ignoring the potholes I hit on my way out. I got to Hank's and saw him pacing back and forth through the window pane and muttering to himself. Hank seemed pleased to see me again. "Let me get your cash," he said, and returned with another dirty $100 bill. "I can only pay you for one more night. Are you in?" I accepted, now more curious about what I experienced than getting paid. I thought about prying Hank with some questions, but had a feeling I wouldn't get any answers. He didn't exactly seem like he was in the right headspace. He was still muttering to himself as I was leaving. I waited in my motel room, not going out to any bars to keep a clear mind. I sped to 50th Street but still had trouble finding it like yesterday. It was almost like it didn't exist. Finally, around midnight, my headlights lit up the street sign and I cruised into the street. The Cutlass started acting up again, cranking and jerking almost like it was scared to move forward. I turned my radio on, but all I heard was static, followed by strange sounds I didn't recognize. I turned my stereo all the way up and coaxed my car to lurch forward. The houses looked like they were in even worse condition, with some missing roofs. The street lights were still off, except for the one at the dead end. I took a deep breath and pushed on, gluing my foot on the gas pedal. An overwhelming sensation washed over me. I felt nervous, similar to how I feel when I'm getting my teeth scraped at the dentist's. Even though I turned the volume all the way up, the static grew louder until it was almost deafening. My headlights started to dim and then shut off entirely. 50th Street wasn't a huge block, but it felt endless, with the light at the end seeming to move further and further away. I yelled in determination and slammed my foot down on the gas. I felt a gear shift and zoomed toward the dead end. Once I got there, my car halted to a stop, and the flickering street light went dark. I took a deep breath and shakily pulled a cigarette out of my mouth. I tried turning the key in the ignition, but the Cutlass stalled and sputtered. It was so dark, I couldn't see anything in front of me. The awful sound I heard last night pierced through the quiet evening, and the street light and my car turned back on. Instead of static, music was playing, though it sounded like old-timey ragtime. I didn't recognize the song. In front of me was a young woman in a tattered dress. Her back was turned to me, so I couldn't make out her face. Her head was cocked to the side, and she stood stoically under the streetlight. I tried to turn the radio off, but it wouldn't budge. I leaned out my front window and tried to get the woman's attention. She slowly turned around, and I still couldn't see her face as her clumpy, mangled long hair covered her eyes. I could see that her mouth was smiling, but it quickly turned into a sour expression. She began to walk toward me slowly and then quickened her pace. I shifted the gear into reverse and sped down the street, but to my amazement and horror, the woman kept pace with the Cutlass. Her face was now contorted with rage. The music grew louder, and I noticed I was going almost 90 miles an hour. The agonizing noise almost made my ears bleed, and I frantically tried to steer my way out of the neighborhood. I looked forward toward the woman, but she was gone, and I realized that my car wasn't moving at all. In fact, I was still at the beginning of the block, only this time the sign read 49th Street. Shaken, I drove slowly back to Hank's, eager to get some answers. But he was gone too. A $100 bill was on the table with a knife through the middle of it. A crumpled up note simply said, "Thanks, kid." I went back to my place and immediately fell into a dreamless sleep. I woke up the following day, checked out of the motel, and headed for California. Spent a couple more years wandering until I found out I was a father. Life has been a blur since then. But recently, I've been experiencing strange events, all when I'm driving. I find myself taking the wrong turns and ending up on streets I don't recognize. I'll drive down the street and it'll feel like it never ends. When I notice something is wrong, I'll end up back where I started, with my car usually turned off. I'll get that feeling of anxiousness, like I'm trapped. Eventually, I'll pull myself together and get to my destination. My doctor thinks it's early signs of dementia. So do my son and daughter. But I'm still incredibly sharp in the mind. I am worried I won't be able to pick my grandbabies up from school anymore. So this weekend, I'm going back to Metairie to look for 50th Street. I never got answers then, so maybe I'll find some now with some extra help from you all. Just got to figure out how this damn GPS works. Wish me luck.